The ALP's New South Wales right faction has been flexing its muscles recently with a stream of vitriol about how extreme and loopy the Greens are and why the Labor Party should be putting the Greens last when it comes to preferences at the next election. Well, they're quite entitled to make these points, of course, but it does look a bit strange when Labor's Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, entered a formal minority government agreement with the Greens and worked closely with them on the signature reform of this parliamentary term, the carbon tax. Leading the charge against the Greens this week has been the New South Wales ALP General Secretary, Sam Dastyari, and the Australian Workers' Union National Secretary, Paul Howes. New South Wales Labor leader John Robertson also joined in the critique ahead of this weekend's State Labor Conference. John Robertson joins me now. Thanks for your time. Do you agree the Greens are extreme and loopy?
Well, I think the Greens are certainly no friends of the Labor Party, and Bob Brown made that pretty clear last year when he said, "I'm not here to keep the bastards honest, I'm here to replace them." And I think it's become very clear throughout this parliament, and even while Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, that the Greens really are blocking some of the significant reforms that Labor's tried to introduce. They knocked back Kevin Rudd on the CPRS. You saw the blockage of the tax cuts for small business when it came to part of the carbon pricing package. And I think it's important that we do have this debate. It's Labor that's got a proud record on the environment, but Labor also gets government and the fact that you need to grow the economy and also protect the environment.
I mean, yes, there have been policy differences, but there have also been pretty pivotal policy agreements. I mean, you can list off an even longer list there: the carbon tax, the mining tax, industry support, something the Labor Party feels very strongly about, not to mention allowing Julia Gillard to form government.
Well, it's not to say that there aren't things that the Greens will agree with the Labor Party on, but it's also important, I think, for the Labor Party to be out there and say there are some things we agree on with the Greens, but we're a party with 100 years, more than 100 years of history. We're a party that doesn't simply believe in protecting the environment. We also believe you've got to grow the economy, you've got to grow jobs, and at the same time protect the environment. Now, that means that there are points where we significantly differ with the Greens, and it's at those points we need to be making those differences made known.
So what should happen? This weekend's state conference is going to be looking at whether the Greens should be preferenced last. Sam Dastyari, the New South Wales State Labor Secretary, says they should. What do you think?
I think we should have that debate. I think it's...
Yeah, but what do you think?
Well, I think that we ought to be saying these people are not our friends.
And on preferences, put them last?
Well, I think that's not a bad thing to be talking about at the conference, and I think that's why Sam's raising this.
But they'll be looking to you. You're the party leader. What do you think on this?
Well, I think that we ought to be giving that some very serious consideration because the Greens are not friends of Labor.
But you haven't made up your own mind on this?
Well, I'm inclined to be saying we ought to be preferencing them last because
You're inclined to say preference them last?
It's an important message for us because these people are not our friends. These are people who are trying to defeat Labor, to take votes away from Labor. And I don't think we should be kidding ourselves that somehow they are allies of Labor or they are friends of Labor because they have shown certainly federally over the two periods that Labor's been in government most recently that they are prepared to also block some of the significant reforms that Labor wants to put in place.
How does all of this reflect on Julia Gillard, though? She did famously sign that minority government agreement with Bob Brown. They're all smiles and photos. She worked with them very closely on the carbon tax. Does this make all that look a bit weird?
Well, I think what you see with Julia is somebody who's pragmatic enough to work out that to govern she needs to form an alliance with the Greens. But that doesn't mean...
With a party that's not your friends, that are extreme, that are loopy.
At times, if you're pragmatic, you enter into these arrangements and you try and work through them. I think what we've seen...
And would you do that if the next state election in New South Wales somehow threw up a hung parliament? Would you form a government with the Greens?
I would not sign a formal agreement with the Greens, no.
Why not?
Well, because I think what they've demonstrated federally is that you can't rely on them in the sense of this is not a coalition government as much as Tony Abbott would like to portray it as one.
So it was a mistake for Julia Gillard to do that?
Well, at the time I think it was the right thing to do. I think the way it's played out, it's shown that hindsight's a wonderful thing. I'm not sure that in hindsight that people would have done that.
So in hindsight it was a mistake?
In hindsight, I'm not sure it should have been structured the way it was.
And was that a failing of Julia Gillard's leadership?
No, I think what we've seen play out is people entered into this in good faith, that there would be cooperation. That cooperation hasn't been there, and perhaps in hindsight it should have been much more detailed about the sorts of things that they would do with Labor that they haven't done.
So it should have been a broader agreement that spelled out we will pass all of your policies?
I think it should have been a broader agreement in the sense that the significant things like the tax breaks for small business, those sorts of significant reforms ought to have been things that were contained in it. But, David, hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, but it's going a bit far, isn't it, to say they should support, you know, various tax cuts along the way. I mean, the carbon tax was the biggie, and the mining tax as well. They supported those. But why should they necessarily agree in writing to sign every tax change?
Well, I think the significance of the tax cuts to small business was part of a reform package that was associated with the mining royalties resource tax and also the carbon pricing tax. And I think those things packaged together ought to have been supported. And as I say, I think Julia did the right thing at the time, entered into this arrangement in good faith with the Greens. I think at times, to be frank, I think she's been sadly let down by the Greens as they've behaved in a particular fashion throughout this parliament.
I note in the list of concerns you have there about the Greens, you haven't gone to the asylum seeker issue, which has fuelled a lot of the Labor anger towards the Greens in the last few weeks. They're not budging on offshore processing. What do you think of their position on this?
I think the Greens, it's one thing to adopt a particular position at a point in time. I think what you've got to be looking at is what is on offer and how do you proceed to find a solution. And at the moment, what we don't see is the Greens moving or looking outside the square for a solution. I think what you've seen, the government's approach is very much one of let's put all ideas on the table, and the setting up of this committee to look at that, I think, is the right approach to that. I think everybody's got to be open to looking at what is the solution here to avoid seeing more and more people drowning at sea.
And that's offshore processing?
Well, that could be part of it, but I'm not into the detail of that. I've got other fish to fry in New South Wales. But my point is...
But have you changed your own position on this issue? Because you've held different position over the years on this.
I have, and I think 10 years ago I did have a position, and these things have evolved. I still think, and my position wasn't simply one of get rid of offshore processing. It was much more than just something as simplistic as that. Well, in fact, and I think that's part of the problem, is that people are trying to simplify what is a very, very complex debate, and it isn't as simple as going, let's abolish offshore processing and that solves the problem, because that wasn't the entire position that I advocated at that point in time.
Mark Latham recalls well the argument he reckons he had with you at Labor conference 10 years ago. Here he was the other night telling us his memory of it. Have a look at this.
And the fact that Robertson 10 years ago didn't have the common sense to know that getting rid of the offshore processing would lead to people drowning. 800 have drowned. He's got to take the responsibility for it. And for young Dastyari, who I'm sure was still in short pants when we had that meeting 10 years ago, son, the horse has bolted. The horse has bolted, and he's bolted up into Corrie Street, and he's now leading your party. He is the problem. He is the problem, much more than the Greens, and he's definitely not the solution.
Definitely not the solution, says Mark Latham. What do you say to that?
Look, if it was a credible former Labor leader, I'd be worried about that, David. But to be frank, Mark Latham attacking me on anything at all is a bit of a badge of honour, frankly.
All right. Let me ask you more broadly about Julia Gillard, the impact the Gillard government's having on state Labor. We're hearing concerns this week, I think it's fair to say, from the West Australian Labor Party. They haven't exactly laid out the welcome mat for Julia Gillard to campaign in the next state election there. Labor are sending out not-so-subtle messages from Victoria that if they lose the by-election next weekend in Victoria to the Greens, it'll be Julia Gillard's fault, not their fault. Is Julia Gillard hurting New South Wales Labor as well?
Well, it's tough federally if you're in Labor at the moment, and I don't think anyone makes any bones about that. What we're seeing all the Conservatives do at a state level is try and cloud state issues with federal issues. They are significantly different. So I understand why people like Mark McGowan are saying to Julia, look, I don't want Colin Barnett given the opportunity to try and drag federal issues into what are state issues and what might be a state election. I watch Barry O'Farrell do it all the time. In fact, I've been in Grafton this week where they were closing Grafton Jail. I watched the local member, in the week he was defending the decision of the government to close Grafton Jail, try and blame Janelle Saffron, the federal member, for the state government closing Grafton Jail. I mean, this is a tactic that the Conservatives are now adopting right across the nation.
Nonetheless, it's fair to say federal Labor isn't helping your electoral chances at a state level at the moment.
Well, federal Labor's struggling. I mean, I don't think anyone's arguing that, and what I think Mark McGowan and others are doing is saying if we're going to do with state issues, let's not cloud them with federal issues, because at the moment that's what all the Conservative leaders are trying to do.
Final issue, John Robertson, the G20. It's going to be hosted in Brisbane in 2014 was the Prime Minister's decision this week, and it's copped a bit of flack in New South Wales, some sour grapes perhaps. What do you reckon? Was it a good call or a bad call?
Well, I think the reality is, if anyone's honest, Barry O'Farrell's made a decision, and I think it's the right decision, to actually upgrade our convention facilities in Sydney. What that means is that they'll be demolishing our convention centre at the time when the G20 is on, and we will not have the facilities to hold the event. Therefore, you do have to look somewhere else. You're obviously going to be looking at Brisbane or Melbourne. If anyone ought to be put out, it's Melbourne, not Sydney. Again, I see a Conservative Premier trying to drag federal issues in to cover up for what's going on in the state.
The federal government blames him for not doing anything about the airport situation as well. What do you think on that issue?
Well, I know Albo's very keen to keep pushing the button on the second airport. We're not going to... I also heard in that very same interview, Anthony also said that we won't have convention facilities either, and that's the reality. They're demolishing our convention centre.
You don't agree with him on the need for a second airport?
Well, look, I've had conversations with the Federal Department of Transport. I've met with Sydney Airport. Frankly, there's conflicting views as to whether we do or don't need a second airport.
What's your view?
Well, my view is I've been working my way through that detailed report that came out of the Federal Department. I've had one conversation already with the head of Sydney Airport. I'm going to have more conversations about their plans.
You're open to a second airport?
I want to get to the detail before I get to a landing. What I do know is the solution isn't Canberra Airport, which is Barry O'Farrell's solution.
But, OK, so that does leave the door open to a second Sydney airport in the Sydney Basin.
What it says is that I'm not going to jump in and make a decision either way. Sydney Airport tell me they've got capacity for another 40 years. I'm going to test that. I want to get to the bottom of that before I jump in and make a decision.
Anthony Albanese's done a fair bit of work on this, though. You have a meeting with him, sit down and chat with him about it?
Well, I've met with his departmental head, Mike Murdoch. They came and gave me a very thorough briefing. I've got that report. From memory, it's about 488 pages. There's a lot of detail in there to get through. And as I say, I'm not going to do what Barry O'Farrell did and rush in and say yes or no. It's important for me to get through the detail, I think. As someone who puts themselves forward as the alternate Premier, I think one thing as a leader you've got to do is make reasoned decisions, not just shoot from the hip.
John Robertson, New South Wales Labor leader, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon.
Pleasure, David.